I'm Audrey Bennett. I am the director of the MDes and Integrative Design program at the University of Michigan. My mission as an art and design scholar situated within a Research One university is to confront historical racist theories and contemporary systemic racial oppression with theoretical and applied research and administrative policies that can galvanize wicked solutions to wicked problems in society, those that are exacerbated or motivated by racial oppression. To that end, my research agenda branches off into different lines of inquiry that study design aesthetics that communicate cross-cultural meaning to impact the way humans think and behave towards yielding social justice and social change. Over the past 23 years, I've worked primarily in transdisciplinary research teams with scholars from a range of disciplines, including technical communication, science, technology, and society, anthropology, educational technology, computer science, engineering, and other fields. The fruits of my labor from these research collaborations typically take form as papers that get published in academic journals and other scholarly publications. One such paper I'm presenting today was published more than a decade ago in the Journal of Design Research, while I was an assistant professor in the Department of Language, Literature, and Communication at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York. If I recall correctly, I would have been going up for tenure around that time. 2 years prior, I remember walking out of the elevator in Russell Sage Laboratory at RPI, where I bumped into anthropologist Dr. Ron Eglash, who at that time had just been hired as an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. And a brief conversation between us then sparked a lifetime of partnership in both research and in life. In this paper, I appropriate a concept from anthropology called autochthonic language that refers to the language of an indigenous people. I appropriated this concept to theorize a visual language or aesthetic for Black graphic designers. Decades earlier, graphic designer Cheryl Miller asked the profound question, what is missing in the design profession as a result of so little input from the largest of all American minority groups? As a result of this missing contribution, Miller describes how Black students feel isolated, rejected, and at times inadequate within primarily all-white design programs. Miller's article begins an important conversation in the discipline on the impact of the absence of Black contributions within graphic design's canon. What is missing, arguably, is an acknowledgement of a Black aesthetic tradition that is respected and integrated into the discipline's canon and nurtured by new Black designers entering into the profession so that it matures. Nearly a decade later, graphic designer Sylvia Harris, in her essay, Searching for a Black Aesthetic in American Graphic Design, observes that Black students studying graphic design tend to collectively display a low self-esteem and confidence in regard to their making a significant contribution to the discipline because they're unable to see what contributions their predecessors have made to the discipline. Noting that Black students are still struggling with the lack of a Black aesthetic, and to address this problem, she encourages students entering the profession of graphic design to translate Afri-Cobra and jazz rhythms, for instance, into graphic form. Since graphic design traditionally fits within the fine arts, Harris encourages design students to also look at the work of African-American artists like Aaron Douglas, one of the leaders of the new Negro art movement of the 1920s for artistic techniques and strategies to translate into graphic language. She also strategically suggests that these students seek creative inspiration from the work of Caucasian artists and designers whose work shows the influence of African-American culture. Two artists well known for being influenced by African masks, for instance, include Picasso, whose work is on the left, and Matisse, whose work is on the right. Not very well known for their relationship to African aesthetic tradition are these examples. On the left is Salvador Dali's piece, where he painted this horrid fractal face with similar smaller faces within the eye sockets and mouth, and again within the eye sockets and mouths of these faces that represent a pattern of self-similarity and infinite repetition. Key characteristics of fractal geometry, which is a tool used for analyzing complex systems. On the right is a piece by M.C. Escher, where people ascend and descend stairs in an infinite loop. In response to the lack of a Black aesthetic tradition in American graphic design history, and influenced by collaboration with Ron Eglash, who's also one of the founders of ethnomathematics, my paper proposes that the long sought after Black aesthetic in American design may be already rooted in the mathematics of graphic design. Indeed, an untapped opportunity remains to pave a historical path from Africa to a Black aesthetic tradition in graphic design. The collective development of an African-American cultural aesthetic in graphic design would increase the confidence of African-American graphic design students and encourage more of them to become graphic designers, and thereby help to diversify the student population at design schools nationwide. Broadly speaking, the inclusion of ethnomathematics as a source for creative inspiration during the graphic design process promises to contribute new approaches that graphic design students can use to graphically structure information in ways that correspond more to a Black audience's cultural preferences and tendencies. In contrast to colonial myths of primitives who cannot count beyond 3, various scholars, including Ron Eglash, have recently reported significant African mathematical practices. And I've based my proposition of the source of the Black aesthetic tradition specifically in Ron's work in fractal geometry and African settlement architecture. That's discussed in this article that he published in the Complexity Journal the same year that Harris's Searching for a Black Aesthetic paper was published in Steve Heller's edited collection. A fractal is basically a shape or pattern that repeats itself at ever diminishing scales. The next series of images that I'm going to show are computer generated fractals that are based on these African settlement architectural designs discussed in Ron's article. The first one is based on the Ba'ila settlement in southern Zambia. The settlement as a whole has the same shape. It is a ring of rings. I found it interesting that there's social meaning in the position of rings within the settlement. The entrance is low status and the back end is high status. At the settlement entrance, there are no family enclosures at all for the first 20 yards or so. But the farther back we go, the larger the family enclosures become. At the back end of the interior of the settlement, we see a smaller detached ring of houses like a settlement within the settlement. That is for the chief's extended family. At the back of the interior of the chief's extended family ring, the chief has his own house as well as 3 or 4 miniature huts, a tiny settlement within the settlement within the settlement. Where offerings are made to the ancestral spirits. And if we were to view a single house from above, we would see that it is a ring with a special place at the back of the interior. the household altar. Here we have the first three iterations of that Ba-ila fractal. We begin with a seed shape that could be the overhead view of a single house on the left. In the next iteration of this fractal, we have a shape that could be the overhead view of a family enclosure. And then finally, the third iteration on the right provides a structure that could be the overhead view of the entire settlement. While African circular buildings are typically arranged in circular clusters, the paths that lead through these settlements are typically not circular, like the bronchial passages that oxygenate the round alveoli of the lungs. The routes that nourish circular settlements often take a more branching form. In this aerial view of the city of Lagoun Birni, in Cameroon, built by the Kitoko, the largest building complex is the Palace of the Chief. Since this architecture can be described in terms of self-similar scaling, it makes use of the same pattern at several different scales. It's easy to simulate using a computer-generated fractal. So here, the seed shape would be a rectangle. After the first iteration, we see how a small version of the original rectangle is reproduced, and one more iteration gives a range of scales that is about the same as that of the palace. During Ron's visit to Lagoun Birni in the summer of 1993, the chief kindly allowed him to climb onto the palace roof and take the photo. They were quite aware of the scaling aspects of their architecture. And the reason for choosing scaling rectangles as a symbol of royalty becomes clear when we look at the passage that one must take to visit the chief. This passage as a whole is a rectangular spiral. And each time you enter a smaller scale, you're required to behave more politely. So by the time you arrive at the throne, you're shoeless and speaking with a very cultured formality. Thus, the fractal scaling of the Kitoko architecture is not simply the result of unconscious social dynamics. It is a subject of abstract representation and even a practical technique applied to social ranking. But that movement was significant to me. You know, when Ron explained that piece to me and how it represented a fractal, that movement reminded me of the Fibonacci spiral and the golden section rectangle, which are mathematical tools that have revolutionized page layout for graphic designers and influenced the integration of the grid in newspaper, magazines, books, and even type design. For graphic designers, the design process arguably begins with the construction of a mathematical grid that may take form as a golden rectangle. A grid provides starting points for the layout of typographic and image-based elements within the composition. Students of graphic design use a grid to determine the boundaries of a page and or bring cohesiveness, order, proportion, and harmony to the placement of its elements. When used skillfully, the grid enables asymmetrical and symmetrical compositions that are organized, hierarchical, and unpredictable in the unlimiting ways in which information can be composed. And when used culturally, it has the ability to communicate identity and even cultural knowledge. As fractal structures of traditional African settlements reveal indigenous knowledge systems that have valuable insights for complexity, these same fractal grids of traditional African settlements could also provide insight for Black designers. Beyond just structuring the page, few consider fractal grids to be a mechanism for creatively communicating social meaning related to BIPOC culture. The reason may be because complex math principles and theories relevant to graphic design, as described in the discipline's existing literature, do not necessarily credit Indigenous Africa as an originator. There may be a lack of knowledge by Black graphic design students and their predominantly Caucasian instructors about the true history of mathematics. Those graphic design students who research African art and culture for creative inspiration may be overlooking or disregarding the mathematics and borrowing only the semiotics and colors. The reason for this may be due to the misconception of mathematics as a universal aesthetic, as opposed to a cultural one. Some 9 years later, I would write a follow-up article tracing the golden ratio from Africa to the Bauhaus. Today, expressions of a Black aesthetic tradition in graphic design tends to be limited to the choice of images, fonts, colors, and cliched African symbols, determined mostly by market research as being effective in communicating to an African-American audience. In 1999, Ron published his acclaimed book, African Fractals, 1 year after his article was published in the previous one I was just discussing was published in Complexity Journal, and Steve Heller's publication of The Education of a Graphic Designer that included Sylvia Harris's essay. So it's just interesting to me that these things were occurring at the same time. But you know, this publication was not necessarily known to graphic designers, maybe and arguably until now. In his book, Ron discusses other evidence of fractal geometry in historical African art. For instance, a lukasa is an African art object that displays fractal scaling and geometric designs. It's also known as a memory board. It's a visual rendering of Luba history from Zaire. On one level, it may be appreciated simply for its aesthetics. It is art. On another level, it is communication. That is, the lukasa's configuration of colored beads that vary in size also serve as mnemonic tools that transmit cultural knowledge. While the lukasa, through its sculptural form, provides a singular organized framework for the transport of Luba history from one encoder to a decoder, it enables multiple memories or interpretations of history. Thus, the audience of a lukasa is empowered with control over the interpretation of its meaning and value. In addition to being an art and a communication object, Ron notes that the cultural pattern of the lukasa depicts a mathematical self-organizing fractal system that uses single beads, multiple beads, and multiples of multiple beads to represent individuals, groups, and generations, respectively. Quite appropriately in the book Memory, Luba Art and the Making of History, Roberts describes the lukasa as a geometry of ideas. The grid of a lukasa provides a mathematical map for attaching these symbols and spatial patterns that facilitate interpretation. Ron also discusses how the African-American cultural practice of cornrow braiding and plaiting, an African tradition that crossed the Middle Passage with slaves being transported to America from Africa, are based on iterative geometric transformations of scaling, rotation, reflection, and translation. Thus, a cornrow using natural hair without extensions can be viewed as a scaling sequence or fractal of Y-shaped plaits that change from large to small as a braid crosses the scalp. Introducing reflections or rotations into the sequence creates cornrow hairstyles of varying complexity. Ron's research is significant across disciplines, from complexity to graphic design and even to STEM education. When he published his book on African fractals, he'd hoped that elementary and secondary students would be able to adopt the content in their math classes, but the teachers had difficulty doing that. So he developed CSCT.org that is accessible 24/7 and is comprised of culturally relevant educational tools for teaching computing, math, and STEM using cultural artifacts. And it was at this time that I joined the design team to help him with, the design of these applets. Simultaneously, we were conducting CSDT workshops at local boys and girls clubs, libraries, math and computer science, and even art classes. And in an early workshop, I recall we asked students, where do cornrows come from? And a typical reply was that cornrows were invented in the 1970s in Brooklyn. So with that response, we knew that we had to integrate a history section into each of these applets. We had to give them some sort of historical background about, the cultural art or the cultural practice we were using to teach them these math and computing concepts. In the workshop, we then divide them into different groups and have them read this content, ask questions, of each other before we moved on to teaching them how to use the software to simulate braids. In the process of teaching them how to simulate braids, they're learning mathematical concepts like dilation and translation, transformational geometry. That is essentially the key word that you'd use to describe the math that is embedded in cornrow hairstyles. So we teach them about the history, we move on to teaching them about the concepts. And then in the early version of the software, we would have them simulate, the hairstyle mathematically. Our tools are not limited to African-American culture. Early versions of the CSDT included Native American cultural artifacts, as well as bead looming. More recently, we added the quilting CSDT that looks at the computing processes in indigenous quilting traditions across BIPOC communities. And here is an example where a student simulated a G's Bend quilt using the visual block coding language of CSNAP. I'm having a little bit of difficulty. All right. What you're seeing now are some of the examples of other quilting designs that were generated using the quilting CSDT. Thanks very much. I'd like to, I pass the mic back to Jazalyn, I'd like to go back to the slide that I missed. I think you can still see this, but this is a publication, um, one of our early publications of this work that shows that the tool CSDT actually shows statistical significance in terms of teaching these students how to code and teaching them STEM knowledge. And it was awarded a General Anthropology Division Award for a exemplary cross-field scholarship. And on that, I'm going to end. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Audrey, for sharing your research and your process with us. I know that we're just all soaking this in right now because it's so foreign to what we're used to. Uh, Not even just like, in an accredited design program or a top design school, but from all of our education, like starting out from kindergarten to what should be considered US history.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so thank you for bringing this and enlightening us. We're so grateful. Um,
Thank you.
yes, and as everyone's like collecting their thoughts, feel free to use the chat to drop in questions. You can also raise your hand, and we can unmute you, and you can share your question if you want to do so. We definitely want this to feel like a true salon and engage in conversation with Audrey. So please feel free to share. Um, I think since I want to allow people time to collect their thoughts, I can just enter in with a first question. Um, so referring to mathematics as a cultural aesthetic opposed to a universal aesthetic, modern algorithms tend to have a negative connotation with biases towards Black communities and BIPOC communities. Do you perceive this being different if Indigenous practices weren't colonized? And how do you interpret the concept of re-indigenizing design?
I wonder, I don't think that we're necessarily re-indigenizing. Um, hmm. That by saying re-indigenizing, it makes me almost think that we're saying that in, that there's no indigenous kind of knowledge within design already. And that was something that I wanted to kind of explain with that piece that I did to show that indigenous knowledge is already embedded in the Swiss design, movement that we have in design that's well known, that it's already there, right? It never went away. It's just that it was never, it's not been brought to the forefront, you could say, right? So someone in chat said, that, I feel fury because none of this information is in my courses. And interestingly, when I was in grad school, that's when I first started looking at the Lukasa. And the reason I started looking at it was because Saki Mafandikwa was my thesis advisor. And I'm sure that's how I learned about that book that I showed on memory. And it wasn't until I met Ron, and of course I was telling him about my thesis and the Lukasa and how interesting that was. And I learned the mathematics that's embedded in that, right? That's how I learned this history that, has been left out of our design history books. I feel I'm still learning about this history now as an adult and a seasoned scholar, right? And I think that that's terrible. So I don't think we're re-indigenizing things. I think it's always been indigenized, but it's just been ignored. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I understand it.
Yeah, I think that actually is an interesting point to make is that as someone said in the chat, the re prefix is redundant because it is ever present.
Hmm. Hmm. That is right. I saw that comment too. It's like, yeah, that's just what I'm trying to say.
I see we have a question in the room. Sven, please feel free to share.
Thanks, Audrey.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by this. Couple of comments. One is that you are the second presenter this semester to spend some decent time on Ron Eglash, and it's fantastic. You know, I mean, I came into the semester unaware of his work, so I would
Yeah.
ask that you pass on to him that people are paying attention and
Yeah.
really getting something from it. I also wanted to. I put this in the. Chat, and it was followed up as well. Everyone should go to csdt.org and just take it in. I think most people are following this as you're presenting, Audrey, but it's really cool. I gotta commend the work being done there, and I know I'll be there using it in the future. And that leads to my question, which is, it sounded like CSDT was being used to engage. Now, I may be misinterpreting this, so please correct me if I'm wrong, to engage younger children. You know, coming from Michigan, University of Michigan as you are there efforts underway to apply some of this stuff to university level courses that you can relay?
I think that's a wonderful question, and it seems to be a popular one. So folks, when they hear that we're working with, high school students, because we're trying to diversify STEM education with this. And so, of course, we start with secondary students, right? But our process, since we are university professors and we engage undergraduates and doctoral students and even master's students now in this work, they're participating in these workshops that we give. They are participating in the design of the software. So when I first met Ron, I don't know if you guys know how web pages used to look, years ago when the World Wide Web came out and you had like black text on a white page. And that's essentially what the software looks like. And so, through the process of testing it with students, we were able to develop it. And we did that through a student team that comprised undergraduate researchers working with us, master's students, and doctoral students. What's absolutely amazing about our doctoral students, back at RPI, we had some students who were doing their dissertation on the CSDT tools. And one of them graduated. And when we moved to Michigan, he simultaneously got a job at Michigan State. And so he has taken it into a new direction with cosmetologists, et cetera. We've had engineering students working with us to look at sports, right? And how that can be used to teach students math and computing. When I showed the early iterations of the software, it was really just based on mathematics and changing parameters to simulate, hairstyles. Our collaboration started with the cornrow hairstyles, and it has evolved into all of these different kinds of CSDT tools. That's moving beyond just teaching math and computing, but really deeper into STEM. One thing that we're doing now is aquaponics, right? Using these tools, which I never thought was even possible. At the University of Michigan, we just taught a grad studio where we had them designing a greenhouse using the CSDT tools. We have a graffiti tool, that I've yet been able to really get some good typography, training out of, but, it's just a matter of time. So I guess just my point is that it's through engaging our university students that I think these tools have developed the way that they have in such you know, a diverse way in terms of the content, the design of it, which requires heavy programming, that was done by postdocs, right? So even though our workshops are targeting secondary students, we have a whole bunch of university students on our research teams, and that's how we're able to get all of this work done.
It takes a village,
Yes.
and kind of like what you were saying, these topics you're still like unpacking yourself as an adult, especially because
Ah,
it wasn't taught to us, and
mhm.
we have to do the work now to try to
To catch
to
up.
yeah, to catch up, and then to also help the next generation.
Exactly.
So Ralph had a question. I'll unmute you.
Unmute. Hello, Audrey. How are
Hi.
you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you for your talk today. It's amazing to hear you speak on such a great topic. One thing that I would love to ask, you know, like where I see a lot of things in your work, you talk about mathematics and fractals and whatnot. Um, does your team or do your students do any work with African patterns, or just like African garb? Just because like it seems very prevalent. And another thing, I know you mentioned it, but I wanted to see like to the extent of what you do with contemporary design and aesthetic through African Americans like graffiti. Thank you. And
I think that's a really interesting question, Ralph. And we have the quilting tool. If you go to csdt.org and click on the quilting tool, you see that we've started integrating Afrofuturism and artists who are working with textiles. Our quilting tool includes the G's Bend community that is coming out of Alabama, and their quilts are absolutely beautiful and amazing. They're an African-American community. And the history section will discuss, once you delve into it, you'll see that it shows how that quilting tradition by the G's Bend quilters, you know, comes from the kente cloth that originates from Ghana. So yes, we do a lot of things on patterns and textiles and things like that, primarily through that quilting CSDT.
So we had some other questions popping up in the chat. Terry says, I was really drawn to Ron's acknowledgement of the through line from, is that Bamana sand divination to the workings of the modern day computer. I'm curious, do you think there's a way to almost lead with binary codes, ancient spiritual origins today to make technology more accessible and morally fair?
I would say yes. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer this question. I almost told Ron to be on call because I knew someone would ask a question that is beyond me. So I don't know that I can answer that. I would say maybe. I think he is probably the most appropriate person to answer that. I didn't tell him to be on call, so I can't call him over to the computer to answer this. I apologize. Terry, I will have to get back to you on that, and I will.
So we might have another question. I'm getting like direct messages with questions. But in the meantime, I want to ask another question. I have notes and I wrote down so many notes, so I'm trying to organize myself through them. Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what is your advice for collaborating with non-Black and non-BIPOC collaborators to decolonize social practices. And I don't know, maybe we need to come up with a different term for re-indigenize if it's redundant.
It's fine. I think that if, you know, they are sincere, then you should definitely work with them. Interestingly, we just did a workshop in New York City virtually with hundreds of students, and we had some white collaborators helping us with the workshops. And some of the one parent in particular did not like the fact that there was a white workshop leader leading the workshop for the kids, because they wanted to see Black people who were, you know, computer scientists, those who are able to lead. I feel that, and then after he met Ron, he was like, oh, okay, I get it now. It's okay, right?
Yeah, sometimes you need to, feel
Yeah,
things out first, right?
yeah. So he definitely walked it all back, because Ron knew so much about him just based on his name. He has an African name. And so, you know, I think that if you're able to find people who are truly sincere and can sort of teach this information in an accurate way, right, that we should work with them. That's what I believe. And we can work with them. But how do you gauge sincerity? This was a question that was asked at the BIPOC design history class. And that is, I really like the way that Cheryl Miller responded to that by saying, sure, you know, we can work with non-BIPOC folks as long as they're sincere about their efforts.
And do you think that's like a process of, I mean, it's kind of like taking time to get to know someone is probably something you can't do overnight, and it's different case by case.
Yes, it is. And, you know, we're in an interesting age now where anti-racism, right, is very important. I find that many people feel that they are anti-racist. They have good intentions, but their actions don't necessarily say the same thing or communicate that, right? So how do you, at the University of Michigan, we're really trying very hard to train the community on what anti-racism is. And actions that are associated with, you know, that kind of framework.
Yeah, because it's definitely slow work, but you know, how to gauge like what needs a quick response and what's going to take more time for really shifting culture inside of these spaces that haven't had to confront these topics and this reality.
Yeah, it's an ongoing battle. I don't think, especially now, it seems that there are some who are resistant to it still, right? So it's an ongoing battle.
So I know we had some questions coming through DM. I want to allow space and not, you know, keep jumping from question to the question that I had written down in my notes. Yeah, Terry, I can unmute you. I see you have your hand.
Did I unmute myself? Okay, I did.
Yeah, you're
Sorry.
unmuted.
Instead of typing in the chat, I just thought I'd just unmute myself. So if I were a teacher and I wanted to apply the curriculum on CSDT in my classroom, is it just a matter of exploring the website and finding my own way to embed it, or like is it open source, in other words, or do I need to?
Oh yeah, it is open source and freely available 24/7.
Wow.
That was very important to Ron. I remember at the BIPOC presentation. I said when I first met him, like, oh my gosh, you've got to charge. And he said, absolutely not, you know, because the folks he's trying to reach, they will not be able to afford it. So he's insisted on it being open source, because before open source was even a thing, right? Many folks at RPI said, oh my gosh, you know, you could be rich. And that wasn't really his purpose at all with this. So it's definitely open source. And when you go to the website, we have teaching materials that are there, that lesson plans that can be integrated in the classroom. If you're on a university level, it might be a good idea to get in touch so that we can work on developing an appropriate lesson plan for, you know, with you. But we do have a lot of teaching materials for each of those tools, and they're constantly evolving.
That's incredible. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm still like navigating through the site. There's so much there, and I just feel like I could spend, I could just
Forever.
spend, yeah, I could spend forever, you know, getting lost in the vortex
Yeah.
of
And Ron
everything.
spends forever on his site. He's constantly just playing with his tool and testing the website every single day. We are hoping to strike a little collaboration with MIT. The programming language is based on Scratch. I don't know if you're all familiar with that, but Scratch is a programming software that was designed at MIT, and it was really targeting young children, teaching them how to code, you know, primary students, teaching them how to code. So this visual block programming language started with Scratch and has developed into CSnap. And it's what is being used in the culturally situated design tool site. So MIT, the Scratch lab, I guess, at MIT got in touch with Ron to see if, you know, we could do something. So that was very exciting.
Yeah, I hope that works out and you can
Yeah,
keep
we'll see.
expanding. They need to do that, you know, we're putting that out in the ether.
Yeah.
Uh, so I know we're like wrapping up close on time and we have, I think, like 2 questions that are floating around. So I want to get to that. In reflecting on aerial views of indigenous landscapes, I am brought to think of aerial views, landscapes, and to tend to how the two tend to look like computer chips. I wonder in thinking about the two landscapes if fractals, not necessarily African fractals, can be applied to modernist structures made for Black and brown bodies.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm a little distracted by some of the comments in the chat, to be honest.
I can also paste this
Yeah,
in
that
the
would be great.
chat for reference. I think carceral landscapes might be the right term.
Oh,
Please
there we
correct.
go.
Yeah.
Mm. Absolutely. There is an architectural or a building that was designed in Ethiopia based on fractals and Ron's work. So absolutely. The greenhouse that we're designing in Detroit definitely aims to reflect fractals. In fact, we're using the CSDT tools to generate the design of the greenhouse and trying to integrate some African futurist textiles and patterns into the design.
So is this like a recent project or an ongoing project?
It's a recent project that's evolved, you know, over time with the aquaponics work that we were doing with students back at RPI. And once we came to this area and started building relationships with the community. We came across a bead museum in Detroit, and you know, the aquaponics project kind of led us in the direction of developing a greenhouse. There's a lot of poverty in Detroit, and environmental injustice, and lack of access to quality food. Farming is a very, very big kind of thing here in Detroit and Michigan, I've come to learn. And so it came together that we might want to try building a greenhouse. And that to me was mind blowing, because I never thought we would ever move in the direction of a greenhouse and architectural structure that is based on CSDTs. But, you know, it completely makes sense once you delve into all of the different tools we have, primarily the Native American tools.
That is amazing. So when is it projected to be completed?
Once we get funding to complete it. So we
Let's
have
put,
some
yeah.
funding, right? We're constantly writing grants to get funding, to hire professional programmers. We're trying to get funding to build the greenhouse. So it's been interesting.
Yes, I'm echoing what's going on in the chat about
Thank
hoping that you
you.
get funded. There's some other activity, as you mentioned, that's going on in the chat. I haven't had a chance to really figure out what is going on. Um, but yeah, I know we're wrapping up on time at 8 o'clock, and sadly, I feel like there's so many questions that I could keep asking you, and especially excited about the greenhouse project. Sending out good energy and good vibes and hoping that, you
Thank
know,
you so much. Thank you.
yes,
I can't
yeah,
wait for it to be, you know, realized.
yeah,
Very-
that'll be beautiful. I hope it's like one of many, because I could just see that popping up in cities, you know,
Yeah,
various cities need this right now.
very exciting.
Yes.
And I think that the pandemic put it on hold because we weren't able to really travel and get any prototypes in the studio out of so.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
I want to apologize. I feel like I might be having a bit of connection issues, but I also want to just thank Audrey again for her time and for sharing her research with us, bringing her energy into the room. You've inspired us all tonight. I also want to give thanks to everyone for joining us and for Cloud Salon. This is as Ben has mentioned, this was our last session for the spring cycle. So I also want to give thanks to our team members, Richard Thay, Sven Travis, who's here with us tonight, my fellow graphic designers, Richard Thay and Challen Chung, our program coordinator, Sam Morrison, and support from the Design and Technology program, John Sharp and Melanie Crean.
thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you so much.
Sam.
And would you please, for all of us, pass a message back to Ron that he's going to get invited to come talk here soon?
Excellent. That's great. I'll tell him about the question. If you can, Robin, if you get in touch with me, please, I will just share that question with him. He will respond to you.
Yes, I'm saving the chat because we've had so many good questions that have came up, and yeah, it'll be nice to just follow up with you.
Sounds good.
All right, good night, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you. Good seeing you. Take care.
Bye.